So what I'm going to talk about is, I'll start off describing some of the things that we've been doing in UCL in relation to information security, and hopefully contrast the approach that we've adopted to BRISSKit, and maybe explore some of the options where we can work together, what may be the obvious joins. There's a couple of people here who are part of the team, very important in actually helping to create the secure environment that we run in UCL. Christiana is sitting at the table there with Anthony, amongst others, have been very important in helping to sort of push this project forward. I think I'm going to probably talk very briefly, and then if there's any sort of discussion that people want to raise, then please do, approach it that way. ISO 27001, the information security standard that was mentioned earlier, is very misunderstood. Most people have never read it, and most people have this kind of strange view that it's something highly technical. The standard is actually very short. To look at. It just simply describes the requirements of what you must do. They're the things that an auditor will look at and check off to see that you've actually complied. There's another document, 27002, which people often think is what people get certified to. That's the guidance document, the code of practice, which basically gives you advice on what you ought to do if you want to meet the requirements of the standard, but that is not what you're audited against. And an ISMS is a dynamic system. It's not something that you just build and then leave to run. It's basically something that you have to constantly work on to make sure that it's effective. And actually, at the beginning of the ISMS, that's probably just the easy part, because it's actually running the ISMS and making sure that you're responsive and learn. That's the critical aspect, the whole point of having an ISMS. So, how do you go about developing one? There's a lot of mystique around this, but basically you've got your planning phase where you must get management support. You must get high-level management to identify this as a priority. Then you can define a scope. In other words, what is it you're going to secure? It doesn't have to be every bit of information that you manage. You can be quite selective in where you define that scope, and that's quite important. It can make a big difference to how easy it is to move forward. Having defined the scope, you then have to formulate an asset register, basically a list of every information asset that's important to you, that you might worry about. And so that's not just data, software, hardware, it can be people, it can be services, organizations, anything that you might want to consider as important that could be threatened in some way. Having defined that asset register, you then, for each of those assets, carry out a risk assessment. So you basically think, okay, what are the major risks that could affect this asset negatively? And then, having identified those risks which are above a predefined threshold, you then go about formulating your risk treatment plan. Okay, what am I going to do to either reduce the possibility of this bad thing happening, or at least allow me some form of assurance so that we know when something bad has happened. And interestingly enough, the thick ISO 27002 is the document that goes through 138 very good things that you might want to do to treat your risk. So basically it's a taxonomy of all sorts of, as they call it, controls that you can apply. And once you've decided what controls you're going to apply, you end up with this document here, which is a statement of applicability. That's actually a formal requirement. When the auditor comes, they will look to see that. And this is basically listing every single control in the standard, 138 of them, to say, did I choose to apply that? And if I didn't apply it, why didn't I need it? So for instance, we don't have any paying customers, so there's a control in there that deals with transactions, financial transactions, and so we don't need to apply that. And in practice, actually, you do tend to have to apply most of the controls in the standard, but that's the process that you go through to define how you're going to apply your controls. Then you actually have to build your ISMS. So you actually act on your treatment plan and build a dynamic system. And this isn't really a technical system so much as a system of procedures, policies, ways that you go about monitoring how effective your information security is. That's in practice, one of the most difficult aspects, because it quite often cross-references many different documents and many different records that have to be managed effectively. What we've chosen to do is use SharePoint. Any document management system will do, but it really is a quite intense document management activity. So it's very helpful to think about how you're going to manage these documents. In some cases, you might want some records in a database, and actually it just depends on the nature of the system that you're having to deal with as to how much can go into just a document management system and how much you might want a database to handle. Then you get to the check phase. So having built your ISMS, you then conduct an internal review. You train some auditors. Christiana and Anthony there were trained amongst the rest of us in internal audit. And you carry out your own internal audit, and you look to find where you think there are some problems in the ISMS that you've created. And you seek to address them. You have internal plans to address that. And you capture all of this. There's an audit trail on what you've done. Then you bring the external auditor in. And the very first time you get audited, there are 2 stages for the audit process. The first stage, he will simply come for, well, in our case, it was a day, and look at the structure of the documents that you've got in place and get just an introduction to the people to understand the context of what you're trying to secure. And actually, there's an awful lot of interviewing, sort of face-to-face interview that goes on there. He doesn't study the documents that closely. The auditor at this stage simply wants to know whether you have a viable ISMS that warrants moving over to stage 2, and he will tell you if there are any significant non-conformities that he identifies, in which case you'll have to rebook a stage 1. Typically, a stage 2 would take place maybe a month or 2 months later, once you've had an opportunity to address any observations that the auditor's made. And at that stage, the auditor will come for maybe another day or 2 days to examine the dynamics of the system, to look at records that have been generated while you've been running the system, to look at how you've approached things that he may have pointed out at the stage 1. Critically, to look at management review, so you need to be able to demonstrate that you've been reporting any outcomes, any observations, any incidents up to senior management, and see that they understand the risk that they've taken on. Assuming you get through that, you get your certificate a few weeks after the audit. We basically are waiting for our certificate to be issued. We got through our audit just at the end of last month. And then we continue to apply any sort of corrective action because obviously, as I said, this is a dynamic system, so we develop any sort of procedures to address problems as they occur before sort of feeding back into the cycle of modifying the asset register and so forth. The auditor, depending on the agency that you use, some may come back annually. In our case, we're using LRQA, who like to come back every 6 months. So we're constantly being assessed and constantly have an opportunity to examine our own practices. And actually, I have to say that the audit process is really helpful in making you think through why it is you do certain things. It was an intimidating idea, but when the auditor was actually there, it was surprisingly enjoyable. This is just some people may recognize this. This is just a slide to illustrate the classic sort of reason model of incident causality, causation. Basically, the Swiss cheese idea, which is if you have a threat, all these controls that you put in place, none of them are going to be perfect. So the more controls you can put in place, the more likely it is that you can actually reduce the possibility of an incident occurring. Now, to talk specifically about the environment that we have, we knew that we needed to have a secure data enclave or safe haven. This term is used within the NHS circles. Basically, universities leak like sieves, so we knew that we needed to have an environment which was independent of the main infrastructure of the university, which would have the sort of resilience and information security controls that we needed. We also know that we need secure endpoints. What do I mean by endpoints? So basically, where the users are sitting, we want to make sure that we've got effective security governing that. So we need an audit trail on how people interact with the system. What they interact with, we have, as epidemiologists, we have fairly generic requirements that we don't tend to use very specialist software tools. Epidemiologists have their bread and butter palette of their favorite stats package, their favorite sort of simple desktop tools that most people are familiar with. So we just wanted to provision a general purpose desktop environment for them to work within. But we knew it needed to be scalable because we know that there are going to be people who come with some specialized requirements, and we know that whatever we put in place, we need to be able to adapt to accommodate to that. We didn't want to be writing all sorts of bespoke tools. We want to use standard technology where we can. Not only the technology to be standard, but crucially, any information standards should be open and not proprietary standards. And, well, I've already mentioned that we don't want too much bespoke software. So what did we end up with? What we ended up with was a virtual desktop environment. So the Windows desktops virtualized within a data center. Rather than using UCL estate, we found a G-Cloud approved data center in Liverpool called Ames Grid Services, who were already ISO 27001 certified. And in fact, we've developed quite a good working relationship with them. We've partnered with them on some TSB grants, and we also have a PhD student, MRCK student, Christiana, who is co-supervised by the chief executive at Ames. So it's a very effective working relationship. But the weakness when we started our engagement was we were able to virtualize within the data center, but we didn't have any certification at our end in UCL to sort of guarantee that we were adopting best practices in information security. So we went down this path of developing the ISMS for our end of the pipe, our endpoint, that could use the secure data center that we hooked into. But it's a very lightweight approach in the sense that we've got these Sunray thin client devices within UCL, but then they go through the UCL firewall, but there's a VPN connection straight through to Ames. So all the server technology is hosted within Ames, which basically means that it's a highly resilient and very secure environment, and there's very little that we need to address at UCL, and actually it's very portable. We could easily put a Sunray in Leicester or anywhere else, and it would be relatively straightforward for us to just adapt the ISMS accordingly. So, I mean, that's the background, and the question I sort of alluded to was, how does this relate to BRISSKit? And really, I think that the answer, probably fairly obvious to you, is that here we have a sort of generic endpoint secure service that allows people to access cloud services. But we haven't got a huge ecosystem of services available to these users. We've got a relatively small palette. BRISSKit, on the other hand, are developing a viable platform for a wide range of services, much more sophisticated than we can offer. But BRISSKit's problem is that it doesn't currently have any way of addressing the endpoint security issue. So the interesting sort of tie-in that I can see is the opportunity, assuming that BRISSKit's backend can get the ISO 27001 certification, is that we can then provide this federated, secure model of cloud computing, which I think it will give us a scalability that we need and be economically viable.